Puebla de Sanabria, 1988, 1985, and 1984. Traditional architecture changes when it is adjusted to urban centers, giving rise to very particular architectural types which, curiously, are similar to others in very distant regions. It seems that the demands for urban planning are more sophisticated than the rural ones and, at the same time, more universally applicable, since they are repeated from one area to another, even surpassing the weight of local tradition and the very constraints and invariant factors of the nearest architecture. We can find similar houses to these from Puebla in many different parts of Spain. These are examples that demonstrate and document the shift from rural to urban housing and, as rural architecture that goes through successive stages of adaptation and improvement, are the basis for traditional architecture in the cities. The houses in these photographs are a good example of this, but they are also representative of one of the great characteristics of popular architecture, namely the total absence of preconceptions or preconceived models in its origin. These show absolute freedom in their composition. On the first facade, there is an unusual variety of openings. A double door, several types of windows distributed at different heights according to the interior requirements, a balcony with railings completing the facade, another large balcony on the upper floor built with turnstuds. The house in the next photo also shows great neglect in the opening of the facade. At first glance it appears that on the ground and first floors there is an attempt at symmetrical order, with the door in the center and a window flanking it on either side, but it is clear that all the openings are disjointed, with no vertical correspondence between them. On the first floor, there is a balcony with two wooden pulleys, while on the second floor there is a corridor sealed off with planks. On both buildings there is no recurrence of elements. Each opening is different. No two are alike, nor is there a rigid order that stabilizes their layout. It is an intuitive composition, based on chance, reminiscent of 20th century artistic experiments following similar modes of composition, often called the soul. The spirit of popular architecture lies in this great variety of forms that come together in a homogeneous and harmonious whole, with absolute freedom in the location of the openings. These are very different schemes from those used in more recent constructions, which are much more rigid and disciplined and, as a consequence, colder and more monotonous.
Puebla de Sanabria, 1984-1988. The two houses in the photographs are magnificent examples of urban housing, developed with a more complex, functional intent than those built in rural areas. In reality, these buildings have two different parts of opposing influences. On the one hand, the ground and first floors are completely urban, with elaborate balconies and windows denoting the primacy of the public space in which they are located. On the other hand, the first floor has typical elements of rural architecture, since the beautiful, glazed porches that were introduced in its construction are one of the characteristic elements of the popular architecture of Sanabria. We can find porches with a very similar layout in many houses scattered through the village of Sanabria if we imagine them with a lower floor dedicated to livestock. The architecture of these buildings showed the complexity of the architectural models that were followed in many villages, as the various influences resulting from their urban character are added to those of the territory where they are located, and a wide variety of elements are incorporated into their facades, which enriches the final result.
Puebla de Sanabria, 1984, 1985, 1988. Puebla de Sanabria is a unique location due to its relationship with the landscape and its own architecture. In the photo we can see some of these characteristics, such as its spectacular location, with its historic center situated on a rocky ridge that stands out from the surrounding landscape. It is a kind of wall with a strong defensive character found on the road that connects the plateau with Galicia. On the other side of the urban center, the road and power lines can be seen on its west-east route. The horizon is enclosed by the snow-capped peaks of the Monts de Leon, which border the Sanabria region to the north. The village is located to the south of the most rugged area, which is the main territory of Sanabria and where its famous lake is located. The historic center of Puebla is surrounded by watercourses on three sides: the Castro River, the Terra, which appears in the center of the image with its bridge, and the Ferreira stream. Thus, the main axis is to the south, from where the photo was taken. The special characteristics of the site have conditioned its urban morphology, which takes the distinctive shape of an almond, with a straight line with maximum inclination that rises in a south-north direction until it reaches the highest part, where the Plaza Mayor and various historic buildings of great interest are located, such as the Church of Santa Maria de la Soc, the San Cayetano Sanctuary, the Castle of the Counts of Benevent, the Town Hall, and other buildings of traditional architecture. Other curved streets are shaped like an arc over the main street, which soften their slope on the west side, with the center more developed in that direction. In the highest part of the town is the tower of the Church of Santa Maria, which resembles a lighthouse overlooking a large area, as can be seen in this and the following photographs. In this second image, to the left of the imposing bell tower, is the junta, with the two pinnacles crowning the two small side towers on its facade. In the photo, the layering of the buildings rising up the steep slope of Constantia Street, leading to the square, is very evident. In addition, the back street binding these buildings to the east is visible.
San Martín de Castañeda, 1978. Mr. José and Mrs. Maria. Rural work is governed by a vital calendar that organizes the daily and annual life of the villages. Every day there is a goal, a task, which are integrated into a constant cycle, repeated year after year, affecting all the inhabitants equally. When it is time to plough, everyone goes out in crowds, as if responding to a silent call, and the fields fill up with the cows' joints guided by firm and skillful hands. The same applies to the rest of the tasks related to harvesting. The daily care of the animals, their morning walk to the pastures and their return to the village in the evening also define their rhythms and routines. The cultivation of the land is the best image of a balanced relationship with nature. I had the opportunity to talk to them, to walk among the furrows, to enjoy the spectacle of honest and dedicated work, and they allowed me to capture their persons and their lives in these photos.
San Martín de Castañeda, 1976. San Martín de Castañeda is privileged of being the parish church of the extinct Cistercian monastery, much of which was lost following expropriations during the 19th century. In the first photograph, the contrast between the rural environment and the magnificent setting of the Cistercian church is impressive. The image presents a scene in which a group of women of various ages kneel as a small procession passes by, all of them looking similar and unified, dressed in black robes, from the youngest, who carry small children in their arms, to the oldest, like the one in the foreground of the image. The second image shows a small procession with the images of the Virgin and Saint Lucia, where the mostly young women are dressed in a modern, individualized way.
Mrs. Aquilina, the moments of work have been the focus of my attention. I enjoyed threading the same ground as the people I was photographing, walking among the furrows they opened with the plows, feeling the earth with intensity, making the geometry of the parallel lines that the furrows draw, with slow rhythm and careful precision, the protagonists of the image. In some of the photos, the human figures diminish as they go about their daily work, on dry, humanized and modeled earth, where the plough raises a dust that resembles the smoke that escapes from its interior by the action of the blades.
Puebla de Sanabria, 1985. In the rural world, there is a great inertia that repeats the same architectural solutions in many of the buildings. Thus, it is possible to find very similar constructions within the same core. It is not mimicry, it is not a vain copy of one's neighbor, it is something much deeper, because architectural types are the result of a refinement carried out over generations. It is the work of the whole community that generates them, the consequence of an evolution carried out over time, in which all the inhabitants have played a part. When a balance is reached between the needs felt and the means available, this solution becomes a part of the people and is used everywhere. What is well invented eventually becomes generalized. The term popular architecture finds its most genuine meaning in this process, since it is the work of the people as a whole. The application of popular types to each specific case takes infinite forms, depending on the circumstances of each situation. No two houses of the same type are the same. They may be higher or smaller, wider or narrower, varying in the number or sizes of openings, but there is no doubt that they all follow the same pattern. They are the same type, applied to different models. In the photograph of Calle de Puebla, 4 two-story buildings are lined up, with smaller facade schemes, with corridors, balconies, and windows. They are different models or practical applications of the same type of building.
Puebla de Sanabria, 1985, 1985, 1988. The plastering and whitewashing of the facades are one of the aspects of traditional architecture that has changed most in recent years. Traditionally, the walls were built with irregular stones in a very characteristic way, combining large pieces with smaller ones that filled the spaces between them. Finally, the very small pieces were pressed together to give tension and strength to the wall, all making full use of the material. On many occasions, masons provided large, well-carved pieces to build the openings, sometimes with inscriptions or decorations, and in many cases with saliences that received plastering so that the large stones were visible. Traditionally, the lower quality stone was plastered and whitewashed, and only the door and window frames were respected. With this practice, the villages were white and bright, and the magnificent stonework was only visible in the places reserved for it. For years, in most, if not practically all villages, there was an interest in discovering stone, looking for the added value that this material could bring to architecture. The plasters were chopped up, and the old walls revived with mortar, which led to a drastic change in the image of the villages, darker and with predominant textures on their walls. This is not a time to evaluate these actions, which have their advantages and disadvantages, but rather to document, to show the historical evolution of the image of the villages, to which Puebla de Sanabria has not been oblivious.
Puebla de Sanabria, 1985. It is always very interesting to observe how architecture adapts to more urban centers, as has happened with Puebla de Sanabria. In the Sanabria region, popular architecture usually has a staircase outside the building and the lower floor is dedicated to stables, while the dwelling occupies the upper floor. Corridors abound on the facades as an extension of the interior space and as a protective barrier against the weather. This traditional architecture was modified in Puebla to adapt it to a very well-defined urban space, with a continuous street where the various facades are aligned. The exterior staircase disappeared and the housing was developed on 2 floors. The unmistakable wooden corridors still remain, alternating with balconies and denoting the more urban sense of these buildings. Towns like Puebla de Sanabria are architectural treasures where you can enjoy the evolution of architectural types specific to the territory in which they are located but elevated to a more urban category. They show that the historic architecture of cities has its origins in rural types, which have undergone processes of transformation, adaptation, and improvement. In the photo, it is also possible to see the original plaster and the whitewash of the facades, which hide the irregular stonework with which the walls were built. In recent years, in many villages, these facades have been removed, revealing the stone base, something that has obviously distorted the original image of the buildings.
Puebla de Sanabria, 1985, 1984, 1985. The shape of the historical center of Puebla de Sanabria is conditioned by the elevation on which it is situated. On its northern, eastern and western borders, buildings reach the point where the steep slope of the land begins, while to the south, a gentle transition naturally develops towards the more urban areas. In the peripheral streets, we find buildings with high galleries in the background that take advantage of their elevated location to become magnificent viewpoints over the surrounding areas, as can be seen in the first 2 photographs. The third photo shows a different case, one where the peripheral street loses its urban character and becomes practically a natural path.
Rabano de Sanabria, 1993. A curious scene is depicted on the lintel of the front door of this house. According to what a local woman told me, a hunter was returning from the fields empty-handed when a neighbor's turkeys crossed his path. Unable to resist the temptation, he shot at them. At that moment, the owner appears, raising her arms and lamenting that he had killed them. The story must have been true, and it seems that the owners of this house were also the turkeys' owners, who argued with the hunter. Thus, the event has been immortalized on the wall with a painting that captures these delightful details. The hunter shooting, the dog accompanying him, 2 turkeys and the woman with her hands on her head in despair. The cut-out lime technique used in this house in Rabano was used in many places and was very characteristic of Sanabria, especially there, where magnificent examples can be found. It involves covering small areas of the exterior walls with limestone. Then, when the lime is still fresh, the images are cut with the razor blade and the excess is removed. In this simple way, very complicated and varied decorations were achieved, such as human and animal figures, geometric and symbolic themes, and other more abstract ones in which the movement of a hand and an arm generate very free and organic shapes. This facade is a blend of many of these themes, as in addition to the narrative scene. The balcony lintel shows what appears to be the sun and the moon in very simplified forms. Above, under the eaves, there is a small geometric frieze with semi-circular arches. Finally, in some parts of the facade there are still lines in the joints of the stones that make up the wall. The house is a magnificent construction, where the work of several trades is combined. The mason, who sculpts the huge pieces, the builder, who builds the walls, the carpenter, who demonstrates his delicate work on the balcony doors, the blacksmith, who makes a sophisticated grille on which appear the letters NG, the initials of Nemesio Guzman, the owner's name, and, finally, the craftsman who makes the decorations in the limestone.
Rabano de Sanabria, 1993. In the construction of stone walls in traditional architecture, we can clearly distinguish two trades: the mason who carves the unique pieces to mark off the doors and windows, and the builder in charge of raising these walls. Each has a very specific skills and tasks. While the mason carves large granite pieces, often topped with mouldings, inscription and decorative elements, the builder raises the walls with stonework of various sizes, placed so as to fill the surface perfectly. The contrast in the cladding of the two craftsmen is very clear, as the photograph shows, with differences in scale and texture between the reframing of the holes and the rest of the wall. It was not necessary for the mason to carry out his work on site. He could supply the carved pieces to people in neighbouring villages, who added them to walls built with similar granite, or with other materials such as slate or quartz. Prefabrication was a reality in the Sanabria region, where the photograph was taken. The stonework walls of traditional houses are made up of two parallel sheets, one inside and one outside, which were not usually interlocked, except at some particular points, such as the corners and the sides of the doors and windows. In many factories in Sanabria, the stone elements were placed perpendicular to the facade so as to join the two sheets of the wall. These pieces, which are documented in many architectural works, have different names depending on the area: tizones, due to the way they are placed on the wall, travas, foras, or chontoiros. We find reference to these pieces in the 10 architectural books of the Roman Vitruvius, a work written in 27 BC. Also put some perpianos facing both ends, which take the whole wall and embrace its two faces, called diantons, with which the solidity of the walls is wonderfully connected. Also, in the Art de Alvenaria, the Art of Masonry, published by Juan de Villanueva at the beginning of the 19th century, it is said, "The stones that were placed so that their length went from one side of the wall to the other were called llaves, and served to hold and contain the wall so that its weight would not collapse and ruin it." In the wall that appears in the photograph by Raven de Sanabria, several of the L-shaped or hook-shaped tizones protrude above the plane of the facade, so that, in addition to joining the wall leaves, they hold the pieces that form the boundaries of the doors and windows. Its presence, its hook, prevents the large pieces of stone from moving, and it is impossible to move inwards due to the presence of the second leaf of the wall. They demonstrate an ingenious use of the material, which is exploited to the full. On the facade, we can count up to 5 of these bars, one on the door lintel, another on one side of the door, and 2 on the other, in addition to one on the left of the image, over the small window carved in a piece of stone which is stabilized in this way.
San Ciprián de Sanabria, 1981. When the cows are tied to the yoke, the going and coming of the plough is done, with the plough supported on the yoke and the yoke between the heads of the animals like a sail or a pole. Meanwhile, the blade drags along the ground beside them diagonally.
Sotilha de Sanabria, 1984. Mrs. Adela. The second of these photographs show the perspective of a house from the threshing floor, a communal space located inside several grouped buildings. The highlight of this house is this magnificent glazed porch facing the interior space and orientated south, looking for the best sun exposure. The wood is carved and painted to embellish the small corner and is not visible from the street, but rather from the inside. This is another example of the fact that traditional architecture does not seek a facadism, so to speak, or an external image. The house should be beautiful in its entirety for the enjoyment of its inhabitants, who will see it equally, regardless of the location of the various elements, and not just the public facade that they share with the rest of the community. It is quite common to find magnificent stonework and woodwork in enclosed, almost hidden places, while the outside is very stiff. It's a great lesson from the rural world. In the foreground of the photograph is the stone wall that separates the domestic space from the threshing floor. Behind this is the woman, returning with the cart pulled by the cows towards the entrance of the stable, which is on the right, under the lower roof that seems to float between the two buildings. On the first photo, we see the same woman, Mrs. Adela, settling the cows on the cart right below the glazed porch when leaving for work, whereas on the second, she is already returning.
Castellanos, 1975. Mrs. Juana. Santiago de la Requejada, 1978. The threshold of the house is much more than a physical boundary. It is a concept with enormous weight in architecture. It marks the contact between the interior and the exterior of the building, between the public and the private domain. From the threshold, we see what is happening outside, but we do not cross the invisible line that defines the home. We are inside, but we see what is happening outside. It is curious the sense of protection we give to limits. Mrs. Juana has not left the inside of her house, but her gaze and attention are focused on what is going on outside.
Rio Negro del Puente, 1978. Mr. Saturnino of Santa Eulalia del Rio Negro at the Carvalho de Fé. In 1978, the La Carvalho de Fé in Rio Negro del Puente was the opportunity to document a very popular cattle exhibition. The streets were full of horses, mules and donkeys, and people were everywhere doing business. It was also a meeting place for friends who took the opportunity to chat amidst the general bustle. There were also street vendors selling all sorts of goods and, of course, the pulperas, women who were busy cooking in steamed pots, breaking and serving the much sought-after octopus portions. This was a great show where everyone was so focused on enjoying the party that they didn't even notice the photographer among them. Many of the fair participants had come on their own horses and, as the first photo shows, were already preparing their mounts for the return journey. It was a time for work, for inspecting the merchandise, and most likely for buying and selling, but also a festive day, as shown in the second photograph of Mr. Saturnino de Santa Eulalia del Rio Negro, who is dressed up for the occasion.
San Salvador de Palazuelo, 1978. Brothers Mr. Ramon and Mrs. Pepper. Since my first steps in photography, I have been attracted to portraying people, to documenting their different daily activities, their work, or, in one word, their life. In 1976, 1977, and 1978, when most of these photographs were taken, I was a young man between the ages of 21 and 23, who ran away to the villages whenever I could because of my early interest in traditional architecture. But when I saw people working, I would stop to talk to them, and if they agreed, I would take some photographs of them. I have no doubt that the best photographs in this collection are the result of a chance meeting and conversation, which led to a foreground look, to a photograph of things and people as we see them, without the aid of an objective lens. In the resulting image, the photographer himself is part of the scene, although logically he cannot be seen. But his presence is evident, in complicity with the people portrayed, who direct his conversation and his gaze. I remember with great intensity the moments shared with them, full of jokes and kindness. For example, the couple posing in front of the stuck cows, who were not married, but from their pose, how could I deduce that they were brother and sister? After talking to them and taking their photographs, they offered me some of the food they took for their work. I had never eaten bacon before, and never did after that occasion, but they offered it to me with such affection and honesty. How could I refuse? I ate it with pleasure, and after so many years I still remember that moment with the same fondness and intensity.
Santiago de la Requejada, 1978. The layout of rural settlements bears many similarities to that found in historic medieval town centres. They are all characterized by the absence of large rectilinear segments, and their buildings are arranged without following strict alignments, but instead present continuous retrogressions and advances in a hypothetical straight line. This attitude is the opposite of modern designs, based on the dynamism of their inhabitants, the movement of the car itself, and rapid communication between different areas. In rural areas, houses grow up with absolute respect for their neighbors, but seeking their own comfort in an apparent disorder that has nothing to do with it. The irregular urban planning of historic centers creates microclimates with a multitude of small spaces protected from wind currents or sunlight. Moreover, this irregularity creates small-scale relationship space where the street becomes an extension of the interior space of the house. The photograph shows an extreme case. To go out in the street, as the lady in the photo did, is to find oneself in a space visually enclosed by the nearby buildings, in an environment known and shared by other neighbors, without distant views or great panoramas, but perfect to the human scale.
Sotillo de Sanabria, 1982. Mrs. Pura. The first villages I visited in the Sanabria region, when I was beginning to think about studying its architecture, are the ones that left me with the best memories. This is logical, as I spent more time in these villages and observed everything with great attention, enjoying every detail I discovered. One of them was Sotillo de Sanabria, a place I visited repeatedly and where I felt comfortable. It was, and is, a very special atmosphere for me. Some of these visits lasted 2 or 3 days, so I stayed in Puebla at Sanabria and from there went to Sotillo for work. I have wonderful memories and anecdotes from that place, such as when I was drawing sitting in the street on a folding chair I had for that purpose. After some time working, the owner of the house nearby came to me, gave me an apple and a pear and said, "Here, son, you're away from home and you never know what might happen. When you draw for several hours in the street, people watching you appreciate your effort, sympathize with you and try to help you." A great detail from this lady and a great memory. I regret that I had no graphic document to illustrate the moment. It belongs only to the unstable domain of memory. When visiting the village of Sotillo de Sanabria on numerous occasions, I took many photographs, sometimes of the same buildings on different dates, because, although I knew I had already taken that photograph, I wanted the new one to provide something much better because of the light or a new framing. Something similar happened with the photo I took, which I repeated virtually the same 2 years after I first took it. Both images show the entrance, built with 3 large granite blocks, with the door open and the keys hanging outside. If the arrangement is identical over a long period of time, it means that this has been its daily state, that the door has remained open, showing absolute trust in the neighbors, because in the calm life of a village everyone knows each other and there is no fear. It is only in the first moments of the stranger's visit, who walks around every corner taking photographs, that there may be a certain distrust, which disappears with the passing of hours and the work sessions. Now, this image with the lady inside seems to me to have many possibilities, reminiscent of 17th century Dutch paintings, with domestic interiors and human figures moving in spaces dominated by perspective.
San Martín de Castañeda, 1978. The structure of the San Martín nucleus is developed in a very straight linear scheme, which climbs the hillside in lines of minimal slope and produces the development of the urban nucleus supported by the main road. This is the scene in the first photograph, with the 2 women walking on the road and hiding their faces from the photographer. This road is also the place for meetings and the place where tents are set up. In fact, it functions as the main area of the village, especially in front of the entrance to the former Cistercian monastery, whose church now serves as the parish church. The arrival of the hawker here appealed to most villagers, who crowded around the bags of goods to buy what they needed, but also to enjoy the opportunity to chat to their neighbors in small groups of animated chatter. Since that day, I have always been impressed by the second photograph, which shows 2 women talking, one of them young, with a baby in her arms, although it is difficult to see it. Both are wrapped in black shawls, one of which covers one of them up to her face, and on the other woman, whose tan complexion can be glimpsed, the shawl serves to cover the child's head. It seems a very representative image of the prevailing social environment, which has standardized people's appearance, making it very difficult to determine their age.
San Juan de la Cuesta, 1988. Mrs. Feliciana. When I was preparing the books about popular architecture in Zamora, first the one dedicated to the Sanabria region and later the one about the lands of Alba and Elist, I traveled around the villages, photographing and drawing everything I saw of interest. One of my aims was to be able to enter the houses, because I needed to understand their layout and, if necessary, draw the plans that would allow me to study them properly. The job was not easy. It took a lot of talking to the owners to get them to agree to let me visit their homes. Although they probably didn't understand exactly what I was looking for, I was very grateful for these people's cooperation. It was not an easy decision to open a door to a stranger, who, moreover, was going to stay inside for several hours, looking at every corner and measuring every detail. Thanks to their generosity and trust in others, I was able to enter and design the houses that are now published, whose organization and construction we were able to learn about, while maintaining the memory of a way of conceiving architecture. Our thanks and memories are intense. We are eternally grateful to all of them. To Mrs. Feliciana, who was one of those who very generously allowed me into her house. Her house was splendid, with magnificent stone and woodwork on the outside and very well finished inside.
Sotillo de Sanabria, 1984. Mr. Salvador and Mrs. Maria. In 1984, I traveled whenever I could Sanabria to draw and try to get to know its architecture as well as possible. I used to visit the villages and all their corners in order to prepare my future doctoral thesis, which was finally completed and published with the title Popular Architecture in Sanabria, Rural Settlements, Morphologies and Typologies. The settlements in the region have a very characteristic shape, dispersed with agricultural and farming spaces between the buildings. In the villages, residential buildings alternate with barns and other agricultural constructions, as well as threshing floors and orchards. To know and understand a place, it is necessary to enter all its corners, because often, around the corner, where the village seems to end, there is another neighborhood are some isolated houses of great interest. Travelling through these settlements, it is possible to observe how quickly one passes from public to private property, practically without any solution or continuity or physical limits. There are private areas where houses are located away from public space. This happened to me in Sotilho de Sanabria, a village of great architectural interest. In one part of the village centre, I crossed the street to a large open space between buildings, which was obviously private, but there was no physical boundary separating from the public domain. On this threshing floor was a magnificent house with a glazed porch and corridor, which opened onto an inner courtyard and was entirely in the inner domain. I have devoted several drawings to this interesting complex, both in perspective and in plan and elevation, which I reproduce in my book dedicated to the architecture of Sanabria. On one of my visits to the place, I found the owners of the house sitting in the corridor working, who, instead of being annoyed, asking me how I had got there and scolding me for entering, received me very affably with courtesy and hospitality, certainly happy that a stranger had visited them. We talked, and they let me take some photos. The man had a disability in one leg, which had probably prevented him from working the field and had forced him to develop other skills. That is why the photograph shows his cane in the foreground. You could see that he was a man gifted with great intelligence, who at the moment was sewing some boots. Meanwhile, next to him, his wife was peeling some potatoes. I always remember the image of balance they conveyed and the liveliness their faces reflected.
Angeeld, 1978. Mr. Julio Prada, bagpiper. In 1978, I was in San Salvador de Palazuelo with a friend, who had to go to Angeeld to talk to Mr. Julio Prada, who was a bagpiper, so that he could give a performance in the village. When we arrived, we found him working at the bottom of the hayloft and he came to us. It was at this moment that I took the photo. He is here in his work clothes, listening to the proposal attentively and with his head down, and is no doubt thinking about his availability to be able to fulfill the request. I always felt that the photo didn't turn out very well and that I could have taken more photos. Asked him to pose, to get closer for a more personal portrait, but I didn't. Although the above still happens, now, with the passing time, I value the photograph even more because it shows the reality of the musicians in the rural world, repositories of an ancestral and very rich musical tradition, which they in turn have transmitted and which some researchers have managed to preserve for future generations. The daily life of these musicians was working in the fields, having music part of another activity in their community. To this activity, they had to add the performances and the whole world of sound in which they were immersed. If we think of it this way, the photograph makes more sense, as it does not show the bagpiper Julio Prada, but the countryman photographed during his daily work.
Vilar de Ciervos, 1990. Mrs. Clementina. In many cases, the owners proudly pose in front of their homes. This often happens not out of vanity, but because of the intense relationship with the house, the love for the building to whose image they want to attach themselves. They are always nice photographs, as the figure highlights the architecture and gives it scale, while the building frames the person. Each element of the composition is reinforced by the other, and both complement each other, making the final scene very enriched. The house in the photo is a good example of local architecture, with magnificent granite masonry work, including the lower double-door lintel and the balcony built with stone bezels and straight wooden legs, where some of the board had already disappeared. The village has been declared an historical and artistic site and has been thoroughly restored.
Quintana de Sanabria, 1984. Sanabria's architecture successfully combines stone and wood. With stone, there is a general tendency for buildings to have a rectangular plan. One is erected with its four well-defined sides, and the others more or less like this, but all maintaining the clarity of their shape. These stone spaces are very evident on the ground floor of the building in the photo, as they define the whole system of supporting spaces and walls, while on the upper floor other lighter spaces are added to these. When necessary, wood is used to build a kind of bridge, which is supported by two outbuildings next to each other, as shown in the photograph, and which also have a wood-based compartment. The result is a totally clean and modern composition, with the two independent materials used consistently according to their own characteristics, each occupying a place and playing a very well-defined role in the construction. The consequence of this is the alternation of vertical strips, stone, wood, stone. In addition, in the picture, the wood is partly embedded in the exterior stone wall, which makes it more individual and offers its own vertical modulation and system of openings, with a homeowner leaning out on one of them.
Limianos, 1981. Mr. Fidel Cervantes, 1987. Mr. Esperanza. As a whole, the country house has been large and spacious, consisting of several rooms, or on the contrary, it is limited to a minimum surface area reduced to the maximum in living area. Its inhabitants always show a great tendency to extend their activity outside the limits of the house to communicate with the surrounding space. Life overflows the walls of the house and settles outside its enclosure. The corridors, galleries, balconies, porches, doorways, and the street itself become a vital setting where multiple daily activities take place, from domestic and craft work to meetings of neighbors who spend their time in lively conversation. The surroundings of the house, the street, and even the square are settings for great social activities. In the two photographs, we see two very different attitudes towards public space. In the former, there is a great respect for the outside world, as its protagonist seeks to interact with passers-by while sitting quietly at the door. In the second, the exterior of the house was colonized by its own objects, thus extending the activity developed inside to the exterior.
Quintana de Sanabria, 1984. The image shows a double lintel in a set consisting of a lower door and an upper window, located on a magnificent facade with regular granite silhouettes. Of note is the careful and studied cutting of the blocks that make it up, organized so that the tensions they have to bear are directed towards the sides and not towards the main piece of the lintel, which reaches 3 meters in length with a central span of 2.25 meters. The carved T-piece below the window is a prodigy of design, because when it comes down under the weights it supports, it does not rest on the lintels, but its ends resting on the pieces on the other side, keeping the weight off the central part. The whole set is a demonstration of common sense, with a sequence that starts from the first lintel, continues into the second, followed by the T-piece and finally the window, which lightens the weight of the lower structures. In the lintel of the upper window, there is a cross carved in bas relief, surrounded by decorations that simulate a semicircular arch surrounding it, to which 2 more arches are added on the sides, with their shape slightly lowered and placed vertically, which are actually brackets with the signs changed order, that is, open instead of closed. The set is a magnificent example of the level reached by the masons in the design of the portals, which deserves to be studied and preserved. It is a pity that the companies and technicians who run the power lines are not of this opinion, something that is common in rural areas. This way they run the cables over the cross and 3 of their hooks are nailed directly to the block where these were carved, which is inconsiderate. These circumstances prevent us from properly enjoying this magnificent work. In the top photo, we are struck by the smiling countenance of the owner leaning out of the square, rigid window. It is a good counterpoint to rigid architecture, as it marks the scale that allows you to appreciate the true size of the pieces that make up this particular gateway.
Quintana de Sanabria, 1993. On the lower floor of the Sanabria dwellings is the main door that gives access to the stables or other interior spaces. The so-called double lintel is sometimes built on it, a solution that is widely present in several areas. In the Zamora province, there are superb examples, especially in the Sanabria region, like the house in the photo. It is a solution in which granite is generally used, although limestone and sandstone can be found to a lesser extent. This type of construction places a large piece closing the door space at the top, supported on the sides of the opening. To this is added a second upper lintel, also perfectly carved, but slightly separated from the lower one by a small groove, so that the support of the lower piece is produced not in the center but on the sides, already on the wall and outside the opening. This lintel supports the weight of the upper wall and distributes it to the sides, avoiding excessive overload of the first piece, whose function is thus practically restricted to limiting the upper part of the door opening without having to bear great stress that could cause it to fall. The second lintel is generally made up of 3 pieces, 2 L-shaped sides and a central one that acts as a keystone. This solution diverts the vertical impulses, now directed horizontally, which are in the end compensated by the mass of the wall on each side of the door, in particular by the 2 large blocks placed at the ends of the L-shaped pieces. The mason's wisdom goes further, as the upstairs window is placed above the door and double lintel, which relieves the weight the lower part has to bear. Besides, the large stone under the window is carved in the shape of a trapezoid and is a real stave which distributes the forces laterally. The presence of 3 small pieces inserted on the right makes sense as a support for this large stave. These press and mobilize the large central stone, since any movement is translated into horizontal impulses. In these stone walls, the small pieces were placed between the large ones, and gravel was inserted after the wall was built, thus increasing surface tension and strength. The set of doors and windows thus defined as one of the characteristic solutions provided by the masters of the portal, uniting the necessary perforations in a single point of the wall, built with singular pieces that clearly differentiate themselves from the whole of the facade. This is a very prudent action, common in the rural world, for a first lintel is built with another, overlapping level, and, for greater safety, the weight to be borne by the first lintel, placed over a window, is relieved. Such assemblies produce a strong aesthetic impression, especially when they are reinforced by the inclusion of carved decorations on the lintel of the door or window, be they a protective religious sign or a text that personalizes the work and indicates the date of production. In Quintana's image, in the center of the doorframe, we can read JHS, an abbreviation for Jesus, to which a cross has been added, resting on the horizontal bar of the H. It is a refined piece of design. Technical acknowledgements. This audio narration was produced within the project Culture for All Bragança of the Municipality of Bragança, financed by the European Social Fund. Reference North 074230 FSE 000058, being developed by the Polytechnic Institute of Bragança. The voice talents in English are by José Luís Castro and Elizabeth Miranda-Pimenta. The audio and video editing was by André Pinho.